All right, what is going on, Patreon boys? As promised, we are not missing this week on the Patreon Q&A. Gonna try to help you boys out with your strength training questions. The septic system freezing may have slowed me down, but it did not stop me. The first one is any new addition / changes to your mobility routine since the video you posted 2 years ago. Yeah, so mobility is going to be something that like you don't want to try to check every possible box all the time, or your mobility routine will get more and more cumbersome and you're less and less likely to adhere to it. I'm very much take a minimalist lens when it comes to my mobility. So instead of trying to take the squat and piece it apart into its individual components, what I will do is I'll try to do a specific stretch. So the third, like a lot of my stretching is like the time spent in the third world squat. I think I've talked many times on the channel about how I like the 5 total minute third world squat routine. Basic lower body stuff. Sometimes the third world squat's enough for my ankles. Sometimes I need directed work for the ankles. That kind of depends. But third world squat, basic front fold hamstring stretch where I'm trying to pull the stomach between the thighs, right? Just basic specificity, right? Like we have squat pattern work. So we do a squat, the most difficult position of a squat as a stretch. We have hinge pattern work. We do the most difficult position of a hinge as a stretch. And if I were to say the big 3 for my lower body stuff, the third one would be either a couch stretch or a lunge stretch. Just because when you're training your quads a lot and they're developing, one of the most common like kind of maladaptations is losing the ability for your hip to go into extension. So your leg, if this is your pelvis, your leg to go behind your midline, and it can kind of mess up your walking gait, can mess up your moving events. I find it can cause kind of back pain when you're walking. So either rolling out the quad or doing the lunge or the couch stretch is kind of my big 3. Sometimes I'll do like a pigeon, internal, external, like kind of shin box switch on the floor. If I've got some rotational issues at my hips, sometimes I'll do like a side straddle, side split stretch just for my adductors. But those would be my big 3 for lower body. And then as far as changes since then, a lot more emphasis on the upper body stuff, stretching the triceps, lots of over and backs, lots of bar stretch in the rack. And then as always, I think the cornerstone of upper body mobility is doing something that you feel in your thoracic spine, whether that's arching over a roller, whether that's a myriad of different thoracic stretches you can find online. But I would say that's currently kind of the framework I'm operating under. What are your thoughts on doing speed pulls for secondary deadlifts on a squat focused day? Pause deadlifts and stiff leg deadlifts seem to mess up my technique, butt shooting up and the pull becomes not so seamless. So what I do is when I'm getting closer to testing a max, that secondary deadlift spot will become speed pulls because I find that it primes my technique for that main day. You could call them speed pulls or you could call them technique pulls. Speed is just part of good technique. It's not the only part. So we're drilling good positions and then applying, once those positions are locked in, we're applying as much power as we can, trying to drill those habits. So that way when we come into that full-on deadlift day, the main deadlift day, it's second nature and we can just kind of go because all we have to do is replicate what we were doing. I find that every minute on the minute format that people talk about for speed work lends itself really well to technique work. If I'm going to do a technique day, I end up selecting that EMOM format. I just think it's a rapid way to learn. Like try something that felt a lot, let me try something else. Just things stay fresh in your head. But what I'll do is earlier in the block, instead of those speed pulls, I will do the stiff leg, I will do the RDL, I will do a block pull, whatever secondary deadlift in motion that's a little bit more beefy, probably likely to add a good bit more tissue than the speed work. Even if it throws off my deadlift technique a little bit, it's more developmentally potent, especially if I've selected something that kind of attacks my weaknesses well. Because I only need to be really, really good at deadlifting pattern-wise when it comes time to max. So just like 3 to 4 weeks of that RDL switching to speed work for me is enough. For some of my athletes, it's longer. For some of my athletes, it's less time. Although you could look at something like a snatch grip deadlift that might let you load it, again, into that more difficult developmental range, but maybe won't have that issue of teaching you to stiff leg your primary pulls. That's something you could potentially look at off the top of my head. What variations plural of the squat, bench, and deadlift do you find effective for broadening your base during the off season for powerlifters? Additionally, what would you generally recommend to young competitive powerlifters, sub-junior, which for those not familiar is below 20, who are working on building their base before transitioning into a strength and a peaking phase? So a part of that's going to depend on your primary technique. Some people's primary technique leaves the squat, bench, and deadlift as great developmental pattern movements. If your arch is good enough to really take away the developmental properties of your bench, then we're probably looking at doing something that takes away those advantages on a secondary day. If your low bar is mega efficient and you've got a really wide stance, maybe we're looking at like a high bar, closer stance day where we're really challenging the knee joint a little bit more through a greater range of motion. If you've got a really efficient sumo, maybe we're looking at like a heavy stiff leg secondary day. I wouldn't necessarily stop working because like your main lifts are your feedback for what you're doing with the developmental stuff being relevant. So what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't say, well, I'm only going to work on stiff legs in the off season and I'm going to reintroduce sumo, because what if we're wrong? What if that didn't actually address like low hanging fruit gains and we're no better off? We've wasted time. So we want to audit periodically. So I wouldn't give up on that big arch bench press. I would just make either many of your back offs or your secondary and tertiary day, those more developmental versions. So like a high bar pause, an SSB pause, depending on your main stance, maybe bringing in the stance, maybe not. Stiff leg, RDL, snatch grip deadlift. If you are a sumo deadlifter, pause deadlift, against RDL, all those same things for a conventional deadlifter, I guess. And then bench press, like close grip variations, feet up variations, Larson variations. Close grip incline can be really good because it's very different than if you're a wide grip, big arch decline bencher. You hit a lot of the things you miss with that technique with a close grip incline. Something like a dip can be good because it's a little bit more similar to your plane of pressing, but I almost find that it's a little redundant for those guys, and I would rather get like the shit that they're missing from their main bench with either an overhead or a close grip incline. I hope that helps. If not, please let me know. I'm always happy to do I'm doing these weekly, right? I'm happy to follow up if that doesn't adequately help you. Hi, I am new to the Patreon. Welcome. Thank you for your content. You're welcome. I realize MEV and MRV have a lot of variables at play. That is true. Curious your thoughts on the following scenario. Very beginner powerlifter, 26-year-old male with a desk job, some background in recreational running and soccer. Okay, that's very helpful. His form is really green, and I choose a conservative approach. The low end range of his MEV to start the first 6 week of a 12-week hypertrophy block, linearly progressing the 3x5. I plan to increase the amount of sets per week in the 6 to 12 weeks of the block. His form and strength are improving, but I am leaning towards keeping the reins on a little bit longer. Would you increase the volume with supporting secondary exercises, main lifts, or a dash of either? That's a great question. What I would do if I was you is I would probably say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If he makes it to week 6 and he's still progressing quite well, I wouldn't bump the number of sets of that squat that he's doing or whatever that primary lift is. If you want, you're like, man, I think we need to be building the base to not just progress well right now, but potentiate longer progression on simple schemes. I want to do a little bit more volume for hypertrophy. Like you said, I might introduce some secondary lifts, or I might teach him just some like basic bodybuilding movements, like big range of motion. Here's how you logbook, here's how you overload. This is something that we're working on in the background to try to draw out how long we can do that base linear. But I used to be, when I was younger, very kind of centered on that MRV number. And I think as someone who was like very obsessed with my own training, that served me well. But for people who are more gen pop, people who are newer, people who are very strong, erring on the side, if we can make good progress, not just any progress, not just barely progressing, but if we can make good progression on less volume, let's rock and roll. Let's just keep going. We can save that energy to keep them well-rounded with a wider base of things afterward, rather than filling up their total work capacity for the day with even more of the exact same thing. Because the other thing we look at with those beginner lifters is we want to keep their training relatively general. That seems to be better than becoming hyper-specific early on.